July 11, 1944, 5:30 hours. Hill 192, 3 miles east of Saint-Lô, Normandy. Inside a Panzer Mark IV dug into a hedgerow embankment, a German tank commander presses his eye to a periscope no wider than a matchbox. He sees hedges. He sees smoke. He sees nothing else. Somewhere behind his hull, close enough that he could hear boots on wet grass if his engine weren't screaming in his ears, an American rifleman is closing the last 20 yards with a bazooka on his shoulder. The tank commander never sees him coming. He never does. By the end of that morning, elements of the 29th Infantry Division and the 747th Tank Battalion will have pushed forward with a coordination the German defenders cannot explain. Panzers that had annihilated Allied armor in open country a month earlier are being knocked out from angles their crews swear were empty. German after-action reports from the bocage campaign describe the same complaint over and over. American infantry seem to materialize from directions where no infantry should be able to move. Not through gaps in the line, not around the flanks in any way German doctrine anticipated. Behind them, beside them, inside the blind space a 50-ton machine cannot see. The men inside these machines were not amateurs. Many had fought in Russia, in North Africa, in Sicily, on a dozen fronts where German armor doctrine had been forged into some of the most effective tank warfare of the 20th century. They knew how to read open ground, how to anticipate an infantry assault crossing a wheat field or a river valley from a mile away. Nothing in their training had prepared them for a battlefield where the enemy could close to within a stone's throw without ever being seen at all. This is not luck. It is not a trick of the fog. It is the result of something the German army did not fully understand until it was too late to fix. That a tank, for all its armor and firepower, is one of the most blind machines ever put into combat, and in the tangled, 12-foot-high hedgerows of Normandy, the United States Army found a way to walk straight into that blindness. The Panzer IV facing that morning attack carried a 75 gun capable of destroying a Sherman at well over 1,000 yards in open country. Its armor could shrug off small arms fire from any angle. On paper, in almost any other landscape in Europe, it should never have lost a duel to a man on foot carrying a rocket launcher effective at barely 100 yards. And yet by the second week of July, German armored units in Normandy were losing tanks to exactly that kind of ambush at a rate their own commanders struggled to explain in their reports back to the rear. The central question this film will answer is simple to state and difficult to solve. How, again and again, through the summer of 1944, did American infantry get behind German armor without German tank crews seeing them arrive? The answer touches optics, sound, terrain engineering, sniper tactics, and one piece of scrap metal welded onto the front of a tank by a sergeant with no formal training in armor design. Every one of those pieces is real. Every one of them is documented. And together, they explain a mystery that cost the German army some of its best remaining armor in France, before it ever reached the open ground where it might have fought on its own terms. To understand what German panzer crews could not see, you first have to understand where they were fighting. Normandy's interior is not the open, rolling terrain that appears in most photographs of the D-Day beaches. Inland, the countryside is carved into thousands of small fields, each bordered by an earthen embankment topped with dense, ancient hedgerow, trees and shrubs rooted for centuries, some banks reaching 10 to 12 feet high. The French call this terrain bocage. Farmers built it as fencing and windbreak. In the summer of 1944, it became one of the deadliest battlefields of the war. Each field was, in effect, its own sealed room. Sunken lanes connected them, cut so deep by centuries of cart traffic that a man walking one could be invisible from 20 feet away. American planners had studied aerial photographs of Normandy for months before the invasion, but photographs taken from altitude flatten hedgerows into thin green lines. No one fully grasped, until soldiers were fighting through it, that the bocage would swallow visibility in every direction at ground level. Some fields measured barely 200 yards across, others far smaller, each one boxed in on all sides. A rifle company advancing might cross a dozen of these enclosed spaces in a single day of fighting, and every one of them had to be treated as its own separate, self-contained battle. There was no front line, in the way commanders were used to describing one, no single ridge or river to hold. There was only the next hedge, and the one after that, and the one after that. Soldiers who had trained for the sweeping maneuver warfare of the North African desert or the beaches of Sicily found themselves instead fighting something closer to house combat, except the houses were made of earth, roots, and thorn, and an enemy rifleman could be lying in wait less than the length of a basketball court away, completely invisible until he fired. For infantry, this was brutal. Every field crossing meant advancing into open ground while an enemy dug into the opposite hedge line, at nearly point-blank range, weighted with machine guns already zeroed on the gaps. German defenders did not need to hold long, continuous lines. A single machine gun team, well sighted in a hedgerow corner, could stop an entire company from crossing one field. American regimental reports from the period describe German positions organized this way again and again. Thin in numbers, dense in automatic weapons, dug into the base of the hedges where they were nearly impossible to spot until they opened fire. The German MG-42 machine gun, standard in these positions, fired at a rate close to 1,200 rounds a minute, so fast that the individual shots blurred into a tearing sound American soldiers described as sounding like ripping cloth rather than gunfire. A crew could hold an entire field crossing alone, chewing through belt after belt, while riflemen 100 yards away tried to find cover in grass barely tall enough to hide a helmet. Losses in the bocage during June and the first weeks of July climbed to levels that alarmed commanders accustomed to the casualty projections used for planning D-Day itself. Some infantry battalions were losing men at a pace that, if continued, threatened to grind entire divisions down to nothing before they ever reached open country. For tanks, the bocage was worse. A Sherman trying to climb an embankment exposed its thin belly armor directly at the hedge line, at the exact range, an angle a Panzer needed to punch through. Tanks that tried to smash through hedgerows instead of climbing them usually found their guns pointed uselessly at the sky, undercarriage briefly airborne, engine straining, completely unable to fire while stuck. German gunners learned to wait for exactly that moment. For tank crews specifically, the danger multiplied the moment they opened a hatch to see better. German snipers, and increasingly American ones too, learned within days of the invasion that a tank commander exposed above his turret was one of the most valuable targets on the entire battlefield. Kill him. And the tank behind him often became a slower, blinder, less effective weapon for the rest of the engagement, even if the hull and gun remained perfectly intact. After-action assessments from the period noted commanders' turrets scarred with rifle strikes concentrated around the hatch rim, evidence of exactly how deliberately these shots were being placed. So by the last week of June, both sides had learned the same lesson from opposite ends. This terrain punished armor that fought alone, and punished infantry that fought without armor. What neither side had solved yet was how to combine the two without simply feeding both into the same kill zone. That problem was about to break in America's favor, not because of a new weapon, but because of how badly the Germans misjudged what their own tank crews could actually see. Sit inside a German Panzer IV or a Panther in the summer of 1944, and the world outside nearly disappears. A tank commander with his hatch open has reasonable vision, but open hatches meant exposed heads, and German snipers in the bocage learned fast that tank commanders were among the most valuable targets on the field. After-action reports from Normandy describe alarming casualty rates among tank commanders specifically, shot by riflemen concentrating fire on any head that appeared above a turret. The lesson armored units drew from this was blunt: stay buttoned up. But buttoned up, a tank commander's world shrinks to a narrow periscope, maybe 2 or 3, each offering a thin sliver of view in a fixed direction. There is no such thing as looking behind you without physically rotating the entire turret, and even then the rear arc is the weakest covered zone on almost every tank design of the war. Add to this the deafening noise of the engine and tracks, which swallows footsteps, shouted orders, even nearby small arms fire, and you have a machine that is powerful, armored, and nearly deaf and half-blind at the same time. Inside the hull, temperatures could climb well past what any man would tolerate outside, sweat mixing with the smell of gun oil and exhaust, the whole compartment vibrating constantly from the engine a few feet behind the crew's backs. Communication between crew members relied on an intercom system that competed constantly with that mechanical roar. A loader or gunner had almost no independent view of the outside world at all. Their entire picture of the battle came second-hand, filtered through whatever the commander chose to describe over the intercom, and only as fast as he could describe it. If the commander's own view was already reduced to a narrow slit of hedge and sky, the rest of the crew was, in practical terms, fighting blind. Now put that machine inside a hedgerow field roughly the size of a football pitch, bordered on every side by dense vegetation 12 feet high. The tank's effective field of clear observation might be reduced to the open lane directly ahead of it. Everything to the sides and rear is hedge, shadow, and blind angle. German infantry doctrine had never needed to fully compensate for this, because in open terrain, the plains of Poland, the steppes of Russia, a tank's blind spots mattered less. There was room to see threats coming from a distance, room for supporting infantry to walk beside the tanks and watch its flanks, room for the tank's own speed to outrun anything trying to close in on foot. German Panzer Grenadier units, the mechanized infantry trained specifically to screen tanks against exactly this kind of close-range threat, were themselves stretched thin across the Normandy front, and in the bocage, their own visibility problem mirrored their tanks. A grenadier walking beside a Panzer IV through a sunken lane had almost the same restricted view as the crew inside it, hedges on both sides, a narrow strip of sky above, no clear line of sight into the next field until he was already standing in the gap. Screening a tank's flank only works if the screening infantry can actually see the flank. In the bocage, more often than not, they could not. Normandy erased all of that room. And American commanders, methodically and often through brutal trial and error over the last 2 weeks of June, began to understand exactly what that meant. There was a second layer to the blindness that made the danger worse for German crews than for Allied ones facing the same terrain. A bazooka, the American shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon, was most effective at ranges under 100 yards, and its 2.5-inch rocket struggled against the frontal armor of a Panzer IV or a Panther. But side and rear armor on every German tank in Normandy was noticeably thinner than the glacis plate crews spent their training worrying about. A weapon that might bounce harmlessly off the front of a tank could punch through cleanly from behind or from the flank at close range, which meant that the exact angles a tank commander could not see were also, mechanically, the angles where his own vehicle was weakest. The blind spot and the vulnerable spot were, for German armor in the bocage, almost precisely the same place. Infantry-tank cooperation before the bocage fighting had been loose, sometimes almost improvised. Units that pushed forward without carefully synchronizing armor and riflemen paid for it. Tanks knocked out by Panzerfausts fired from hedges the infantry hadn't yet cleared. Infantry pinned down by machine guns the tanks hadn't yet suppressed. What emerged instead, field by bloody field, was a discipline that would define the entire remainder of the Normandy campaign. Infantry would move first into a hedgerow, clear it of the anti-tank teams hiding inside, and only then would the tank commit to that ground. This single sequencing change, infantry first, armor second, is the first piece of the mystery. It meant that by the time a German Panzer crew registered a threat at all, American riflemen were often already established inside the very hedgerow the tank could not see into. But sequencing alone doesn't explain how infantry ended up behind tanks, not just beside them. For that, the story moves to a specific, less celebrated piece of engineering, and a hidden flaw in how the German army read the ground itself. By late June 1944, American commanders had identified the core tactical problem correctly. Tanks needed a way to move through hedgerows without exposing their bellies on top of an embankment, and infantry needed tank support that could keep pace field by field instead of stalling at every hedge line. the standard method for breaching a hedge, blasting a gap with explosive charges. Sometimes two 50-pound charges laid by accompanying engineers worked, but it was slow, and it announced exactly where and when an armored breakthrough was coming. German defenders, listening for the demolition charges, knew when and where to reposition their Panzerfaust teams. The mystery of American infantry appearing unexpectedly could not rely on a method the enemy could hear coming from a quarter-mile away. There was an earlier, even cruder solution units had tried first, welding lengths of angle iron or scrap rail to the front of a Sherman and simply ramming the hedgerow bank head-on. In practice, this mostly succeeded only in tearing a shallow gouge out of the earth while exposing the tank's underside to the same Panzerfaust teams the maneuver was meant to avoid. Some crews described the sensation as driving straight into a wall that only grudgingly gave ground, the engine screaming, the whole hull rocking, while infantry alongside them held their breath waiting to see whether a German rocket would find the tank's belly before it broke through. It was not a solution. It was a temporary, dangerous stopgap, and everyone fighting through the bocage in mid-June knew it. The answer came from an enlisted soldier, not a general. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, an armored cavalryman, proposed welding steel prongs, cut from the German beach obstacles nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, that littered the Normandy coast, onto the front of a Sherman tank's hull. The prongs let the tank drive directly into a hedgerow bank and tear through it, roots and earth and all, without exposing its belly or needing a demolition charge at all. Mechanics attached to the 2nd Armored Division built the first working versions within days. Soldiers nicknamed the modified tanks rhinos. There was a strange, almost circular irony buried in that improvisation. The steel that let American armor punch unseen holes through Normandy's hedgerows had, only weeks earlier, been part of a German defensive system built to tear open the hulls of Allied landing craft on the beaches. Scavenged, cut apart, and re-welded, the same iron that Rommel's engineers had planted to stop the invasion at the waters, edge became the tool that let American tanks appear from directions the German defense of the interior had never planned for at all. Within a matter of days, workshops across the beachhead were producing the prongs in volume, and by the eve of Operation Cobra in late July, a significant share of the Shermans committed to the offensive had been fitted with them. The modification cost almost nothing, required no factory retooling, and could be welded on by ordinary maintenance crews working with cutting torches in a muddy field. A homemade fix for a problem that had, until then, been treated as an unavoidable feature of fighting in Normandy rather than something that could simply be engineered away. The tactical effect went far beyond simple mobility. A hedge cutter tank did not need to use the sunken lanes and gaps the Germans had already sighted their weapons on. It could punch through the hedge at any point along its length, a point the defenders had never expected to be breached at all. Combined with infantry moving ahead through adjoining fields, this meant an attack could suddenly appear from a hedge line the German defense considered impassable, arriving at an angle nobody on the German side had planned for. This is where the picture starts coming into full focus. German defensive doctrine in the bocage was built around covering the obvious approaches, The sunken lanes, the established gaps, the corners of fields where movement was expected. A tank that could tear a new hole in a hedge anywhere along its length broke that entire logic. And a rifle squad that slipped through an adjoining field while the tank's noise and dust drew every German eye toward the point of the breach could reach the flank, or the rear, of a defensive position that believed it was watching every possible approach. American commanders reinforced this advantage with a change in unit organization as much as equipment. Instead of massing tanks in large formations that struggled to maneuver in the confined fields, armor was broken down into small teams, sometimes a single tank or a pair, attached directly to individual infantry companies for the duration of an attack. This meant the men on the ground and the crew inside the tank could coordinate almost continuously, using hand signals, runners, and eventually dedicated radio links, instead of relying on a plan drawn up hours earlier that could not account for what a single hedgerow actually held. The tank became, in effect, a supporting weapon carried alongside the infantry rather than a separate force operating on its own timetable. A reversal of the armored doctrine both sides had trained for before the invasion, and one the German army in Normandy never fully matched. There is a second, quieter piece to this same puzzle, drawn directly from how infantry tank teams began operating together after the brutal fighting for Hill 192 outside St. Lo on July 11th. Officers of the 29th Infantry Division, after that attack, formalized a lesson the men in the hedgerows had already learned the hard way. Infantry needed to move ahead of and around the tanks, clearing bazooka and Panzerfaust teams out of each hedgerow before the tank was committed, and then continuing forward on foot past the tank's own position, into ground the tank's crew could not yet see. Reports afterward described a single attack near Saint-André-de-l'Épine that advanced 3,000 yards, including a 90-degree change of direction, without losing a single tank, a result unheard of in the bocage only weeks earlier. To a German crew inside a buttoned-up Panzer IV, half-deaf from the engine, watching a narrow slice of hedge through a periscope, none of this coordination was visible. What was visible was a Sherman appearing where no tank should have been able to cross, and American riflemen already inside their flank before a single shot had been fired to announce them. Consider what that moment felt like from inside the German position. A defending squad might spend an hour watching the far hedge line, tracking every American movement toward the expected gap in the corner of the field, weapons trained on that single approach. Then, without warning, the crash of a hedge tearing open would come from a completely different point along the boundary, sometimes 30 or 40 yards from where anyone was looking. And by the time heads turned toward the sound, riflemen who had used the noise and dust as cover were already moving into the field from the side, closing distance the defenders had never accounted for. The defense had been built to watch a door. The Americans had learned to come through the wall. But even this new system had a hidden weakness, one that would nearly cost the entire Normandy breakout before it produced its greatest success. Operation Cobra began on July 25, 1944, southwest of St. Lo, and it started with a catastrophe. American heavy bombers, tasked with saturating a narrow corridor of German defenses ahead of the ground assault, dropped short. Friendly fire killed over 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the most senior American officer killed by enemy or friendly action in the European theater. For a few terrible hours, it looked as though the breakout attempt might collapse before it began. 2 weeks earlier, on July 18th, American forces had finally taken St. Lo itself, a town so thoroughly destroyed by the fighting that soldiers who passed through it afterward described a landscape of rubble with barely a wall left standing above shoulder height. The town's capture had cost the 29th Infantry Division and its supporting units dearly, including the death of Major Thomas Howe, whose flag-draped body was later laid across the ruins of St. Lo's Cathedral, in a scene that became one of the defining images of the entire Normandy campaign. That cost was the price of exactly the field-by-field, hedge-by-hedge fighting this film has traced, the grinding education in bocage warfare that would pay off, at far greater scale, only a week later. It did not collapse because the very hedge-and field tactics developed over the preceding month held together even under that shock. Infantry tank teams, now practiced at working the bocage field by field, pushed forward into a German defense that the bombing had, despite its errors, still badly mauled. Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best-equipped armored formations in the German army, had taken the brunt of the bombardment directly. Tanks were flipped, buried, disabled by concussion before a single American round was fired at them. What followed over the next several days was the moment the mystery this film opened with reached its full, brutal expression. American infantry, moving through fields the Germans could no longer fully observe or defend in continuous strength, kept finding themselves on the flanks and rear of German armored positions that had been organized to face forward, toward the expected line of American advance. Survivors of Panzer Lehr's shattered units, along with paratroopers and grenadiers scraped together to plug gaps in the line, reported the same disorienting experience that tank crews at Hill 192 had reported weeks before. The Americans were behind them before anyone saw them coming. By July 27th, American armored columns had broken into open country west of St. Lo, moving faster than German commanders could react. The bocage that had cost the Americans so dearly in June had, by the end of July, become the terrain that let them break the German line without the kind of grinding, visible buildup that would have given the defenders time to reposition. Within days, the offensive that had begun as a narrow breakthrough attempt turned into a general collapse of the German position in western Normandy. Entire formations that had been dug into the bocage for weeks, confident that the terrain itself would continue to blunt any American advance the way it had through June, found themselves outflanked and cut off almost overnight once American armor reached open ground where its speed, rather than the infantry's stealth, became the decisive advantage. Prisoners taken during this period frequently described disbelief at how quickly the front had dissolved. A defense that had held for 7 weeks against grinding, incremental attacks came apart within roughly 72 hours once it lost the one advantage that had sustained it, a battlefield small enough and blind enough for a handful of well-placed automatic weapons to hold an entire field. Historians estimate Operation Cobra's opening bombardment dropped several thousand tons of explosives onto a narrow strip of ground barely a few miles wide, a concentration of firepower unlike anything the German defenders in that sector had experienced. Panzer Lehr's commander later described the effect as comparable to fighting through the aftermath of an earthquake, with entire companies rendered combat ineffective before making contact with a single American soldier. There is an important nuance the film must be honest about here. German commanders were not simply outwitted by cleverness. Some of what unfolded was the predictable result of a defense stretched too thin, of a chain of command disrupted by the loss of senior officers, and of an army fighting under near-total Allied air superiority that made daylight movement of reserves extraordinarily costly. Historians studying the breakout have noted that Panzer Lehr's collapse owed as much to the concentrated weight of the bombing and to manpower shortages as to any single tactical innovation. The infantry tank hedgerow tactics were real, documented, and decisive in specific engagements, but they operated inside a wider collapse of German defensive cohesion, not in isolation from it. Still, the specific and repeated pattern German tank crews reporting enemy appearing from directions their own doctrine considered secure did not stop at St. Lo. It followed the German army into its next and most desperate attempt to reverse the entire campaign. August 7, 1944. Mortain, Normandy. Adolf Hitler had ordered a counterattack aimed at cutting off the American breakout at its narrowest point, driving armored spearheads west to the coast near Avranches, and severing General Patton's advancing forces from their supply lines. Divisions including the 2nd SS Panzer and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division were committed to the assault, some of the most capable armored and mechanized formations Germany still had in France. At the center of the German advance stood Hill 314, overlooking Mortain, held by roughly 1 battalion, about 600 men, of the 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, a formation known within the Army as the Old Hickory Division. German forces surrounded the hill almost immediately, cutting it off from resupply and reinforcement. For the next 5 days, the trapped Americans endured mortar barrages and direct fire from 88 guns, calling in artillery on their own positions' approaches to hold off repeated infantry and armored assaults. Supplies had to be dropped by parachute, and even then, a significant share of each drop fell outside the perimeter the Americans actually controlled, lost to the same close, broken terrain that had shaped every battle before it. Wounded men who could not be evacuated lay alongside those still fighting, medical supplies dwindling by the day. And yet the position held, not through any single dramatic stand, but through the same grinding, hedge-by-hedge discipline that had carried American infantry through the bocage since June. Hold the close ground, deny the enemy a clean line of sight, and make every yard of advance cost more than the German command was willing to keep paying. What makes Hill 314 essential to this film's mystery is not the siege itself, but what happened around it, at ground level, as German panzers tried to press past isolated pockets of American infantry entrenched in orchards, sunken lanes, and hedgerow country, nearly identical to the terrain fought over in June and July. The lessons of Hill 192 and the Cobra breakout, infantry clearing close terrain ahead of and around armor, exploiting the tank's narrow forward vision, using the hedges themselves as concealment for movement the tank crew could not track, were, by August, standard practice across the American line. German armored spearheads driving toward avalanches found their flanks harassed by exactly the kind of close-range infantry action that had bled Panzer Lehr weeks earlier, even as Allied fighter-bombers, flying with near-total command of the air, hunted German columns from above. The Mortain counterattack, which the German command had code-named Operation Ludwig, failed within days. Trapped between infantry it could not fully suppress at ground level and aircraft it could not evade from above, the German armored thrust stalled, then collapsed, then became the beginning of a rout that would trap tens of thousands of German soldiers in the Falaise pocket later that month. Roughly 50,000 German troops were ultimately captured as that pocket closed in the third week of August, with thousands more killed, and much of the armor that had once been among Germany's most capable in the West abandoned along the roads leading out of it, destroyed as much by Allied aircraft as by ground fighting. By the time that collapse was complete, the pattern this film has traced from a single hedgerow near St. Lo to the hills above Mortain had become, for German panzer crews, a grim and repeated experience. Armor that could dominate open ground and outgun anything the Allies fielded tank for tank was, in this terrain, functionally blind to the infantry closing in around it. Not because German crews were poorly trained, not because their optics were defective by the standards of the day, but because no tank design of the war was built to see in every direction at once, and the bocage was terrain engineered, almost by accident of French agriculture, to punish exactly that weakness, once an enemy learned to exploit it. Return for a moment to that Panzer IV commander on Hill 192, I pressed to his periscope on the morning of July 11, 1944. He was not careless. He was not poorly led. He was sitting inside one of the most heavily armored and heavily armed vehicles on the battlefield, operated by a crew as well trained as any in the German army. And he still could not see the American rifleman closing the last 20 yards behind his hull, because nothing about his tank, and nothing about German doctrine built for open terrain, had prepared him for a battlefield subdivided into 1,000 blind rooms, rooms that American infantry, hedge by hedge, field by field, over 5 brutal weeks, learned to move through faster than his own senses could track them. That is the full answer to the mystery this film opened with. German panzer crews never understood how American infantry appeared behind them because the appearance was never magic, and it was never luck. It was the product of a terrain that erased a tank's greatest advantages, sightlines and speed, combined with an American infantry doctrine, refined at a brutal cost through the hedgerows of Normandy, that learned to move inside exactly the space a tank could never watch. The bocage did not defeat German armor by destroying it in open battle. It defeated German armor by making it deaf and half-blind, one field at a time, until the men closing in from behind were already there before anyone thought to look. It is worth remembering, too, that none of this was inevitable. The Germans built a formidable army, one that had already conquered most of a continent, and their tanks in Normandy were, in raw specifications, often superior to the ones facing them across the hedges. What decided the outcome in these fields was not a failure of German engineering or German courage, but a mismatch between a doctrine built for open ground and a landscape that never allowed open ground at all, and an American army willing to learn that lesson field by field, at whatever cost, until the men inside those tanks could no longer trust their own eyes. For the German soldiers who survived the bocage and lived to fight through the rest of the war, the memory of Normandy's hedgerows stayed with them as something closer to nightmare than battlefield. A world with no horizon, no warning, and no direction from which the next attack could not come. That, in the end, is the answer to why the Panzer crews never saw the Americans coming. In that landscape, by the summer of 1944, nobody could see very far at all, and only one side had learned how to use that darkness as a weapon.